So we'll get started in just 2 or 3 minutes. We have some people who have not been in the room for some reason. Let's go ahead and have a seat. Everyone, please. Could we get a scribe volunteer or volunteers for this morning? It's just this morning. Who's willing to do their service? Thank you for your service yesterday, folks. Anyone? Anyone?
Bueller.
Thank you, Elliot. Thank you for the dinner. We had an excellent dinner suggestion from Elliot and company from Elliot last night. Truly fantastic Lebanese food. Thank you for steering us away from the genius. Any volunteers for scribe, please? Just one more.
Kevin, can I interest you? Kevin?
I think Kevin did it at our last meeting, if I remember.
Yeah. I'll do it again.
You'll do it again? Sure.
My turn.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. Very fun. Okay, so let's get started. Before we get onto the topics at hand, a couple of things. We know that there is not coffee out the front. We know that for some people that is a quite dire situation. We'll probably take a break a bit early as a result. There is a decent, although expensive, surprisingly, coffee place just up the road. We may take a trip to. The other thing I wanted to briefly touch on. So this morning I was cleaning out my email, as one does, and I came across an email that I'll post a link to in the chat, the meeting. And it's an article that, although it's about free speech in the interesting context of that topic these days, I think it highlights something that's been on my mind and Suresh's mind for a little while now, and that's how to have a good conversation. We need to have a good discourse in this group to make progress. We need to come to consensus, and the really high points of it are to have a good conversation. It puts forth you need to have respect amongst participants. You need to have good faith participation. And you need to have charity, and charity is kind of almost the other side of good faith, in that you have to assume good faith in others. And I think, as we said on the list, Suresh and I have been concerned about this for a while. We see a good amount of respect in the interactions we've seen, especially this week. We also see a lot of good faith. We see people who are really trying to do the right thing for the internet, and not only for their businesses or their interests, but acknowledging that there are wide divergence in perspectives. What we've been worried about most is this third factor, the charity, the assumption of bad faith in others, and what I'm happy to see, at least this week, is it seems like we're making progress in that. It seems like we're kind of breaking through that and starting to have some real discussions and trying to understand other people's points of view. And that's going to be really necessary, I think, for us to make progress in this work. This group is not a typical IETF group in that the interests and the issues that we're dealing with are not just technical, they're much larger societal issues. And to come to consensus on the way forward, we really do need to have good quality conversations. So I guess that's just, like I said, we walked in this much more concerned about this. We're seeing progress. Please continue. Please continue to engage in good faith. Please try your best to assume that others are doing the same. Understand that we all make mistakes, and that sometimes we become defensive or we don't see others' points of view, but have that charity and make sure that we have the best conversation we can. Anything to add, Suresh? No? And then, by the way, that is a great organization. It's the Ethics Center. It's one of the Australian organizations, despite the fact that it's based in Sydney. It's really good. Never mentioned. Okay. So today, I think what we want to do is continue the discussion from yesterday. We were talking about the proposals around search and use and AI output. We had that top level discussion, but I think we've put a pin in that for the time being until we resolve some of the more granular controls and get more comfort around them. We also have a discussion of we have some issues around the other texts in the current document, the section 3.2. We could have a discussion about that, but I'm not sure that's really going to be fruitful at this point. It seems like we're making better progress in the core vocabulary. There's some definitional issues around AI and other things which we could get to. But I think really focusing on the continuation of yesterday's probably the best use of this morning's time. We also have the attachment document, but I think Suresh and I agree it's not terribly useful to talk about it yet. We really need to get to these vocabulary issues first. Unless someone has something really burning that they think we need to resolve before we can make progress there. We do want to reserve some time at the end of this morning. We're intended to go to 1 or 1? To 1, okay. Probably 45 minutes or a half an hour before we'll do a stock take, talk about next steps, talk about the potential for future meetings and what's involved in that. So I think we'll probably take a break around 10:15, 10:30, give people enough time to go get coffee, and then we'll power through to the end there. Make sense? Any other thoughts that people have? Okay. So this morning, a bunch of folks met and gave some time to try and figure out if they could make progress to bring to the group. Did they have anything to report? Any output of that discussion?
Oh, I don't think there's progress on this one.
I think there was.
Just to my
I don't think there's progress to it.
do we have a better understanding of what the differences are?
Not really. Like honestly, it wasn't put up there.
What do we need to make it productive?
Coffee. We're trying to tell you.
It's hard to tell at this moment, but honestly.
It's changed.
I can give it a try. So I think one tension is between having categories that are intuitively easy to understand and categories that are technically precise. So maybe to give you an example, if in the search context, the expectation from somebody who might encounter a search category might be, I will show up in Google search, but I will not show up in a ChatGPT response, as sort of one way of thinking about this. And another way of thinking about it is that both in the Google search context and in the ChatGPT context, it depends on what the specific output actually is. Like, is it an exact quote from the thing that is being referenced? Does it link back to the original source? Does it paraphrase around it? And I think we have not agreed on what would be the better approach to focus on what does the application do versus do we think it is a search application or not.
So one of the things we can do in that situation is try and make each of those alternatives as crisp as possible in separate drafts. But if I'm a little concerned there, I suppose, that if they're so diametrically opposed, that doesn't help towards convergence either. Heck,
Yeah, sorry, I'll put myself in the queue in a minute, but I guess I'm trying to maybe I want to see if I can circle a little bit on what the challenge is here. Is the challenge that people don't think they understand how to encode these differences in a specification, or is they don't think that these are actually clearly formed distinctions? Because like I'm much more worth at the second than the first.
Just speaking for myself, my concern about having categories that are mapped to specific product types is that that's brittle over time. Because, product types evolve, new things emerge. And so I'm definitely on the side of it's better to define functionality or behavior rather than kind of, try to have a search category. But I do think it would be productive to maybe have that higher order discussion of whether people think it's a better idea to draw the kind of product boundary versus the, you can use this if you link and only direct quote.
So let's use the queue to manage. Chris?
Yeah, just to add to what Felix was saying, there was, the discussion kind of focused on the AI output category and potentially having like a search subcategory within that. I mean, the AI output category, broadly affecting things like grounding and RAG type usage. There was another argument being made, but we didn't discuss the AI training category, but like with like the argument being that like with search engines making much more use of generative AI technology, that generative AI training would need to be an integral part of how search engines operate, and therefore I think this is now calling into question the existence of the generative AI training category, and that like would raise like huge concerns, I think, from the sort of publishing community, where that's one of the core goals I think of this group is to have a very sort of clear definition of where content and material can be used for the training of models. And it just seems to be that like the more that the argument says that all of these things are intermixed and they're not separable, I think the less we're going to be able to come up with a set of working definitions that are going to be meaningful to creators and publishers to actually use.
So, first of all, I want to start by acknowledging that there was a lot of hard work done to even have these discussions this morning, and it's much appreciated on behalf of the community, because I don't think there's an easy way to have these conversations except by putting in the hard work, and I think that needs to be acknowledged because we're all tired, and it was quite nice to actually have something to ground our conversations at. So I'll start with that. So I'm not quite as pessimistic as if we didn't make progress. I would say that we made a lot of progress on the trust that we have with each other to have these conversations. So that goes back to what Mark was pointing out. I will also say that the fundamental questions that we have still up there is what Erin was pointing out. Do we actually specify exact product categories into which we want to ladder up to? Or do we want to focus on the kinds of outputs that people are most interested in? I think there is outcomes. So I think the general movement towards a focus on AI outputs is actually a good thing. The issue now is how do you actually position it so that it is inclusive of all the demands that are being placed on on such a system, and how do we articulate it better in the drafts? So there's still some work needed before we can say whether search should be a category or not. I believe it should not, but there are others who believe it should. And so there are some fundamental questions of whether search being a product category, is it even worthwhile to specify it? Those kinds of questions still remain. I would say that we're making slow progress. We're not bottomed out on it clearly, but I think there's a lot more space to have these much more trusted conversations right now.
Mark?
My arm's not that long.
So I think there's a couple of things that came out for me about this. One is this sort of requirement Chris talked about in terms of trying to address this desire on the part of folks who are putting content online to be able to say they want that content to be discoverable, but not necessarily have that content then used in the generation of models or what other uses that a little concerned about. I think that having a little bit of a discussion about that requirement is probably still necessary, and we probably need to get a little bit more clarity about what that means for different people. But the thing that I think I noticed is quite difficult in this situation is that there's a lot of interconnected pieces. And it seems to me like it's difficult to say, yes, we can make progress on this piece without also acknowledging that there are other pieces that are left unresolved. And so one of the things that came up yesterday was if we start to focus on this sort of AI output concept that was introduced to the group, that reintroduce and not focus on search specifically as a thing, because I think we are sort of slowly coming to the conclusion that being able to look at properties of things rather than trying to label a particular application type is the sensible way to deal with things, because of the way in which there is no clean demarcation between things like your classic 10 blue links and something like a chat application. So recognizing that there's this interaction between that concept and model training, out of the points that Aaron made yesterday, is something that we can acknowledge there's a connection, but continue to make progress on the definition of this output thing without getting bogged up with the fact that there's 7 different things connected into it. And so I think what we're stumbling on at the moment is the fact that we're trying to concentrate on this one thing and make progress here, but people keep bumping into the fact that, well, if we do that, then we still haven't solved this other interconnected problem. And I think for some people it was the connection of that AI output thing with the model training thing. For others, it was this idea that you might have some sort of stipulations around it that included direct quoting of things, and the need then to be able to put some constraints on how much quoting was involved and the nature of the quoting and whether or not there was a link, or all these sorts of other aspects of that problem. And what I would ask of people is that they set some of those interconnected things aside and see if we can make some progress on things, and not fixate on the fact that they know that it's incomplete because there's this interconnected problem that needs to be resolved. Focus on making progress on that issue, keeping in mind that it's not done until we've resolved all those other things. But that, I think, was where we started to sort of spiral this morning. And I thought we were close, but it turns out that those interconnected problems were continually tripping us up. And so focus and discussion, I think, is one of the things that I would ask of people. And sort of being able to recognize that those problems need to be set aside in order to make progress.
And just before we go back, one of the things I'm looking at is, is it useful for us to spend more time in this room today like this, or is it more useful for us to break early and give folks more time for those type of conversations?
That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, think about it some more. Heck,
Yeah, in terms of the general process, I think that the reinforcement board said, in a complicated system like this, you have to resolve pieces one at a time. And the convention you have to agree to is that nothing's agreed till everything's agreed. And like, so, like, if we can't, like, hum on like thing A, if an interaction thing B, and you have to understand that if we do it's provisional, blah, 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 right? So that's just like, people have to, like, kind of hold those things together, and really have to backtrack. I do actually think it might be useful, as you say, to like, hard as it may be for those of us who are not part of the like ad hoc design team, to sort of let them do some stuff for a while. It's very hard to make any progress in a room this big, and we really need to have something which like a critical mass of people thinks is like solid, so that other people can be in the mode of like, okay, now I need to take some time to reflect on this, and we're not always going back to first principles on everything. So and that's not a terrible suggestion. We have had 2 days of discussion. It doesn't bother me if I get the rest of my day back. With that said, I did sure want to push on the thing Chris was saying earlier. I think we had an extensive discussion yesterday about the way these systems work internally, and the fact that like basically the entire thing is generative AI model. And so I just think it's very hard for people to say the most important thing for us. Like you can say, I don't want to be training on an AI model, but the technical consequence of that, as far as I can tell, is Google search can't work at your site. And so, like, I think it'd be helpful if we were able to find some way to phrase the thing you're asking for in a way that was not about that, because it just seems like if you're going to phrase it that way, like basically it's game over. And it seems to be what you're asking for is something different, not that Google not internally have an LLM, a transformer-based LLM, like looks at your data. I think that's generative. But that it somehow be used to synthesize a big chunks of text and sent to users. And so I don't know if this is how you phrase that, but like it seems to be if you think this is a part of it, it's you're not going to get any progress at all. So I think we're going to have to spend some time trying to drill into that in a way that makes some sense, because it just seems we heard yesterday is that's like an incompatible requirement with like search engines working at all. And as I understand it, people want that search engine working. So I mean that's like not even about writing. That's not even about writing this text. It's about like trying to think about how we're going to break the system down.
Sure. Thanks, Iker.
Start off?
No. Okay. So one question I want to see to dig in is like, how did this split happen? So you, Paul, you talked about like people who are wanted simpler labels and people who wanted more nuanced things, right? Would it be fair to say that people who wanted expressive preferences wanted the simple labels, and the people who wanted constrain them wanted more nuanced stuff, or am I generalizing stuff there? Because I'm thinking if that's an issue, maybe we should try to see is there a way to kind of take one set of labels and transform them to another set of labels? But I don't know what exactly happened. But I was just thinking if that was an issue, maybe to explore that path.
I think the labels is a bit of a red herring, right? Like if we define the underlying categories, we can call them. We could it might just be useful for us to not get tripped on the labels to give them code names, right? Like give them animal names or something. I don't know. It's not the labels. I think there is part of the sort of why I'm very pessimistic after this morning is that sort of we went in this meeting thinking that we had one part that was relatively stable. That was the training side of things, right? And by now we've we made no agreements on any of the other things, and we've now also put into question that. So we've factually in the past 2 days we've managed to regress, and there's nothing, honestly there's not a single piece which is not questioned at the moment. And I agree with the Eckert thing, nothing is agreed on until everything is agreed, but that implies some progress of agreeing on more and more pieces, and we seem to be disagreeing on more and more pieces as a result of this. And I think the biggest problem on it, and to your question, right? I think it is will go away. I think there is a relatively there is a, we went into this discussion with a set of relatively simple, sort of design objectives that were largely expressed from the content owner side. And we have by now sort of like almost dissolved all of them in relatively complicated technical terms for good reasons, right? But the sort of like this loses this risks losing the purpose of the group to some degree if we do this too much. Just like, I want to jump in on Ecker, but the goal of this group was not to make Google's search as it is right now possible. That is not why this group was chartered, right? The group was chartered in order to give content owners the ability to express preferences with what entities like Google in AI context can do with their things. And by now we've lost, like, consecutively over the meetings, over the course of this meeting, more and more of the people can still articulate these demands from the demands from those people who are supposed to express the preferences, right? And we're trying to build a vocabulary for them to express, and then for the company to, and it becomes hard to sort of like obviously the conversation, if there's Chris admirably sitting there with like 6 other people who are not content, they're content owners in other contexts, but like who are not sitting there as content owners, right? It becomes hard to sort of like have even like a equal conversation, and that makes it really hard to get out of this sort of like dynamics that we're in at the moment. And I think on an interpersonal level, like, I agree, like there's trust and respect between people, like you say, but on an, like, I think if I look at take bird's eye view and on a sort of bird's eye level, like I think there is a lot of important stakeholders to this discussion who seem to have lost trust in this process.
So, I mean, I certainly agree that the purpose of this group is not to make Google search work, but it seems to me that the high level ask for getting all technicals for the content owners is, I would like search to continue working, and I would like other things not to work. And there already is a way to say, I don't want Google to name my data at all. I mean, just block them or was that text. So the point is to have a more fine-grained apparatus. And so I'm not talking, so like, and so like what I'm saying is your actual ask has to be phrased in a way that is like technically possible. And so that's what I'm trying to drill into, not like trying to protect Google search, which, I mean, like, that's not like my job.
It's like
Please get
a very simple actual.
Or someone else make you.
Felix?
Yeah, trying to think about how we can be productive for the rest of the day. I mean, I didn't think I would say that. I agree it's might be better if we had more publishers in the room. But one way to address this issue is actually breaking up into smaller groups. Like if it's creating a bad dynamic to have 6 AI developers to discuss with one publisher representative, is to pick one of the 6 and have them sit in a room and try to come up with an agreement or with a proposal on one element, which could be this AI output category, or it could be the question of the training. But I think at a certain point, like it was also news to me that basically the AI training category is not consensual, which is unfortunate. We could dedicate a group to trying to address that problem, and it could be addressed in different ways. It could be more fine-grained controls on AI training, or it could be being more clear in maybe the accompanying documentation what the pros and cons of picking a certain category are. Because one way you can approach this is to say, okay, if I opt out of AI training, there is a chance, not a it's not a determined thing, but there is a possibility that this will have a negative impact on findability, and this is a choice that I can make when I express my preference. Or the other approach is to say, I want to make it as likely as possible that I will be found in search, and therefore I'm willing to give a more fine-grained preference around AI training. And I think these are both valid ways forward, but it might be useful to focus the discussion a bit to have these two discussions, like the discussion on training and the discussion on AI outputs in different groups.
Mark was.
I put myself back here.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, like it was more of response to echo, like I think it was considered in the discussions to this group to be, I think, a legitimate expression of choice, say no to AI training, right? Like that was a feasible, possible, legitimate thing. Like I think the basic understanding of everybody in this, or the basic, nobody in this room had articulated otherwise until yesterday. And so like I think that means like, and I think it's a legitimate thing. Like there was a question at the end of the first day, which we somehow didn't answer. We sort of like, I think one of the things that were thrown up on the screen, which was, do you think it's, like we wanted to a poll on, I don't know, you can maybe remember that better, but like it was this question, do we think it's legitimate to say no in the overarching sense, right? And for some reason that question was not asked and answered. And like, I think the question is also that we need to understand what do we think is legitimate to express in terms of preferences on the side of those who use content and want to express preferences about it. And it seems that this meeting in a number of places has run into things saying, oh, maybe legitimate, but technically not feasible, right? And that wrenches. Like if then legitimacy becomes subservient to technical feasibility, I think we're in bad place.
How could it not be?
You could like, there are external constraints on building systems, and if internal constraints sort of can mean that you have to do different design choices. We're living in a society where external constraints are produced and systems are built that try to address to those. Like the answer could be like, I don't want to get product specific, but the answer could be maybe there's certain things you can't do, or you don't want to do because you respect, like not even like because of legal constraints, but voluntary constraints. We're not going to do this because we believe it's bad for the ecosystem or the relationship with certain partners or whatever. Like that's possible.
Yeah, Tom Vaughan, Common Core. So I agree with what's been said about focusing on the chartered stuff. But something that I've been thinking about quite a lot over the last couple of days is that people, if they're expected to use this vocabulary or whatever vocabulary to assert certain things or to express preferences for certain things, they should be informed properly about what the consequences of that are or will be. Because I'm British, this is a thing that kind of it's painful to talk about this, but there's a really good example of when something like this happened. We call it Brexit. The entire country was asked a binary question, and they weren't informed of the consequences. Now, several years later, we are all dealing with the biggest pile of crap that has happened in that. Well, I mean, there's so many different ways where that has come back to bite us, and lots of other people, by the way, in Europe and around the world. It's not just the people who have, anyway, without going too much into why Brexit sucks.
Would you like to give a short talk about Brexit?
Yeah, actually, thanks for coming to my TED talk. This is Brexit 101. But this is another opportunity for calamity if people aren't informed about the actual consequences of the thing. So this is, I like that there seems to be consensus on that people agree that this could be disastrous, and I think the lack of agreement isn't necessary. I'm a little bit more optimistic than Paul. I think that it's nice that people are being careful and considering things rather than rushing into something that could very well spell disaster for lots of content creators and lots of search engines and everybody in the ecosystem. It's not just one type of person who stands to lose from this. That's all. Thank you.
So I'll reinsert myself in the queue briefly, mostly because I'm pretty sure I should have to do that. Because it's a good time to bring up what I was thinking of, which is when I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking about design principles, architectural principles that might help guide these decisions. And one of the design principles is to make things as complex as they need to be, but no more complex. And I think that goes to a lot of the tension that we're seeing about how detailed these instructions need to be. One of the architectural principles you need to think about is avoiding ossification. And I think that goes to some of the concerns that are being expressed about how we're going to lock in the internet into how it works right now or how people think it works right now and not allow it to evolve, which is widely agreed to in the IETF is an undesirable outcome. And so maybe if we can start having these discussions in terms of what the principles underlying these things are, it might get something a little more clarity. Sure.
Yeah, so I'm a little less pessimistic Paul than this, right? I think like probably part of the I think part of the issue, like if I may call it that, is that maybe regressing a little bit because we're getting more information, right? Like so we are kind of realizing like the world is not as like simple as it seemed even last week, right? So we are seeing a bit more things are complex. But I think the right solution for that is to figure out like how an expression of preference affects what happens in a given set of applications, right? Like so once if somebody says search equal to yes and AI training equal to no, as long as it's clear what that entails, I think we should be able to make progress, right? Like, but even it may not be the thing that people exactly wanted to have, but at least it should be clear that what they're getting with that expression, right? I think that's probably the best we can hope for, is to make sure that people can make the preference expressions that they want to make and make them be unambiguously understood, right? Like, and I don't know if you can do any better than that. They will say like, hey, this will do exactly what I want to do. But like, I think the goal is to convey what people want to say rather than what they want. Does that make sense? Well, you can answer that.
Well, it's like respectful for everything.
Okay.
Good.
I'm just saying that like people should be able to make expression of whatever preferences they want to express, as long as they understand what they need. I think that's what we can hope for, right? Like not what they want, right? Like, but is that clearly understood by the person making the preference and the person consuming the preference? But and the consequences are understood. I think that's the best we can hope for.
I think that has been a design principle, and I think like I agree with what Tom said, with one caveat, right? Like the Brexit is really hard to resolve. Like I think the way we're designing these things, like if any actor in the system notices adversarial consequences of making a certain choice, these can be reviewed. We're thinking like there might be some attachment mechanisms that make that a little bit harder if you embed that into things where sort of the things then independently circulate, but specifically in the attachment mechanisms that we are mainly concerned about here, like it's sort of like, okay, you flip a switch that causes something to break, you can reverse flip the switch again, and hopefully, like I don't think in any of the preferences that we have right now that causes permanent damage, right? Like so I think I agree with you on this. Like obviously we need to
May I interject very quickly, just with a quick follow-up to that, is that we should also, in this room, if we're expected to come up with this vocabulary and attachment mechanism and so on, we need to understand it better than anyone. We can't go into this kind of having a vague understanding of what the consequences are of certain assertions or preference signals. If we expect people downstream to be well informed and to understand what, what stuff means. We have to understand that ourselves in order to communicate that. So I personally don't understand. I don't feel like I understand the full consequences of certain, assertions. But anyway,
You said just making interjections.
yeah, sorry, I want myself into the queue.
Daniel. Microphone down that end? Some, wait.
Maybe in service of trying to narrow in on the issues that are causing some of this, and maybe this is a question for folks who are in the conversation this morning. Is the tension I'm understanding here about AI developers who also operate a search business, which isn't all AI developers, right? And if that's the narrow expression of the issue we're discussing, it seems like there is an empirical technical question, right? What can or can you not do in operating that search business and these AI products at the same time based on the preferences expressed? We know there are different user agents that do different things. We know there are different ways to think about this. And if what we have is an empirical technical question about what is possible for that narrow set of folks engaged in these two businesses, maybe what we need to do is go back and have a technical discussion about what are the design possibilities here. And to the extent we discover they're inseparable in a way that is truly intractable, that's an important piece of information. But it doesn't seem clear to me that this group understands that yet or has the information required to understand that. I don't think I do. And so if that is the narrow expression of the issue, and folks should feel free to disagree with me if they think I'm wrong about that, then maybe that's where we need to understand what the design possibilities are, because that doesn't seem to me to be the whole issue, right? Like, I think a lot of folks in this room agree there's a possible legitimate preference to express to not train AI models on your content. But that's, I think, different from it is so intertwined as to be impossible, and I just don't know that I have an understanding that would allow me to parse whether that's possible or not.
Okay. Oh.
So I really like the Brexit analogy. And I think it's not just about kind of unintended consequences. I think it's also about people not necessarily having clarity around what they're actually voting for. And I voted to remain, by the way. Anyway, I think,
Just to be clear.
just to be clear,
We should be friends.
I do wonder whether, the ambition to opt out of AI training is really around wanting to opt out of training for generative AI models, where you don't want your content to essentially inform the knowledge that's built up in these models, because we've heard that AI models are used in all sorts of ways to build search products. So I just wanted to be clear that there is, that option of still being able to opt out of generative AI training and remain in search. And I think we're possibly thinking about AI training too broadly.
Okay, Gary.
So I missed some of the discussion because I was fixing the coffee situation, which is fixed, hopefully.
Yes.
But I got this weird thing in my head. Would this discussion not happen if Google offered an opt-out from AIO and AIM?
What's that?
Like AI overviews, AI mode, and whatever. Like, would it change anything?
Yes.
I don't know the answer to that question. Thank God. I mean, so I know people don't want to. I know there's concern about focusing on search, but I think it is a key part of this equation. I think it's totally reasonable to say I don't want anybody using my model for essentially and my content for essentially any purpose whatsoever. They don't get stuff in a model. That's totally legitimate thing to say. And if you're like happy to live with the consequence, that means there's an appearance search engines, then like we should accomplish, we can give you a category for that. If the property you want, however, is that you want your data to appear in search engines. They would ask, how do you express, how does that get set, right? And structure of, because as I think it's been made clear, like the search engines depend on AI models. So it's what the structure of the current draft, right, is to essentially just carve out the search category and say like, it's totally cool to like train your AI model on this stuff. The purpose of search for no other reason, and there's a way to say that, right? And where that got stuck, it seems to me, is on defining what search is, and then the kinds of issues Aaron has been raising about like, you know, locking search and amber from non-perpetuity, right? And hence it seems to be, now not part of the constitution this morning, but the attempt to provide a operational functional definition of what the carve out here was that did not involve using the word search, basically, right? And if that works, then great, right? So, but I think like when I hear people, but I guess what I'm going to try to get back is when I hear people say, but my understanding was that still involves technically in these systems involves generative AI, and so you can't even have the generative AI categories more functionally. What you need to say is generative AI, okay, but there's another category which I'm going to say search, we'll call search, right? Which is like this operationalized version of search. That's fine, right? And so, but again, I think like. And I think it's perfectly true to say I don't want any generative AI training on my data, but like the consequence of that I think is going to be almost going to carve out that you don't like that outcome, right? And so, it seems to be like if people object to that framing of the problem, then I'd like to object to the framing of the problem. If people think, oh no, it's like actually it's really hard to operationalize like that thing, that's a different problem, right? But if people think that framing of the problem is fundamentally wrong, that's a different thing than like we think it's really hard to like operationalize. And it may be impossible to operationalize. But when I hear people say, oh, I just don't want generative AI training at all, my next question is, do you want to train search? And I think if that is the property you want to have happen, they would have to figure out a way to make that happen.
You.
Oh, there's good. There, okay. Couldn't see it.
Yeah, huge plus one to Edgar's point that we should think and talk honestly about what it is we want to have happen as participants. I added myself to the queue a while ago and things have kind of moved on, but I did, the thing I wanted to say, and I'm going to say it quickly anyway, even though I might interrupt the flow, is that having worked on the Google publisher controls that exist now, I understand and empathize with the people who are trying to engage with these technological systems in order to bring them under some sort of, you know, definitional taxonomic order. It is not easy, and you know, I had the advantage of working with people within my own company who, you know, I had a shared basis with, and also that I spent many years being the only tech company representative in meetings that were full of content creators and rights holders and other folks. And sort of, I used to start my standard talk with, I'm here from the internet and I've come to tell you that everything's going to be okay, which they didn't agree with, but at least it gives you a sense of where I was coming from and how I was situated in the room. And I really empathize with that. And I want to make this work for everybody. So that was what I was going to say, but it was 20 minutes ago, or 28 now that I talked so long. But anyway.
Aaron.
That's my. Yeah, so similarly, I put my hand up a little while ago and the conversation has moved a bit. But I think I am in the kind of odd position of, you know, representing the search engine that everybody is worried about and trying to design for. And I really think it's a better idea not to pick one product and try to fit the taxonomy around that. I think that if we make reasonable choices and then tell people, like sort of, you know, like Tom's Brexit example, if we give people, you know, concrete, accurate information about the consequences of their choices, then they can make their choices. And so I hope that you take my input as informative about what those consequences are likely to be, not guaranteed to be, so that we can consider that, but it shouldn't be the deciding factor. And so that, you know, I'm maybe more optimistic that we're going to find a solution here, because I think that we can we don't have to solve every problem perfectly. We can get reasonably close and then let people make decisions.
Sebastian, just in the mic, please.
Oh, actually, just there's a question in the chat that Martin is asking, do I think there's a way to say yes to search and no to model training? And the way our search engine is built, and I think all contemporary search engines, it is either one or many massive large language models and multimodal models, depending on how you want to slice them up. And so we cannot understand queries, we cannot understand documents, we cannot rank results without having models capable of doing that. And we can't have models capable of doing that if we can't train them. So
Can I just ask a clarifying question?
There's an obvious, yeah.
Does that refer to the specific content? Like if this specific content is not in the training data, we can't surface it? Or is it more like if suddenly 30% of the content is opted out, it won't work?
So in the case of one specific piece of content, if we've never seen it before, but we have seen everything else, then probably we can handle it pretty well. I can't guarantee anything because if it's totally novel, it's totally novel. In the case of a significant amount of content that opts out, there will be categories of content that are better represented in the training data and better handled. There will be categories that aren't. And we essentially can't say the first 25 to opt out can opt out and then nobody else, right? So,
26.
yeah. So, obviously, like the company has not made decisions about what it's going to do because there's no vocabulary to react to in a concrete way. But I think the most likely outcome is that if you opt out of training, we will treat that as an opt out of search entirely because training is part of the bundle of being in ranking. And I know that that is a challenge for splitting training from the kind of 10 Blue Link traditional Oktoberfest search that we talked about. But it is not possible to have a quality product if you aren't sure whether you're going to be able to, train and improve it. And so but if that is the case, that people want to opt out of training anyway, that's a choice that we could give them that they should have.
Erin, isn't it to some extent solved by having a separate generative AI training category and allowing people to opt out of that? And I appreciate that will have an impact on the search that's powered through the summarizations, for example, but it would mitigate that risk. Right?
So yeah, introducing yet more technical complexity. The generative training category right now is written in terms of capability, not usage.
Only for general.
Okay, well, the transformer-based models, when you teach them to read, they can also write. And so it's not a coherent distinction to say generative versus non-generative models, unless you're talking concretely about how they are used in practice. But also, a lot of our models are used to rank in ways that involve generation. And I put up the example of our WebGuide experiment, which ranks things into categories with semantic labels. We also have our top stories feature, which condenses news results into a category with semantic labels. And so there is also not a clean distinction between the search features that are, I would say, long form generative, search features that are short form generative, and search features that are, purely a bare list. And if we had to come up with that, and we had to have separate models to do that, I just don't know if we're able to.
So that it goes on to the question that Martin asked in chat, which was on my mind as well, is what if the models used for search can only be used for search? Would that be feasible?
By policy or by technology? By policy or by technology?
I think.
Well, and by search, with a capital S, the product, or with search, the lowercase category that we're trying to define as like some component?
That gets into the definition of search.
Yeah.
Sebastian?
I think it's not about use of AI in search. So, and I mean, all we are dealing with has to do with AI. And what I wanted to come back to one question that Martin raised at the first day, which I took seriously, but maybe it was a joke. Like, should we allow creators and rights holders to express preferences, or should it be possible for creators to express their preferences? And the charter is clear, and I would like to come back to the charter where that also mentions vocabulary that we can actually use and we should use. So it's about creating building blocks that allow for the expression of preferences, how content is collected, processed for AI model development and deployment and use. And I think we have the two kind of categories there: the training of the model development, and second, the deployment and the use of the models or AI output. And search is obviously one kind of use of the trained model. So we have, and in the first category, we distinguish two scenarios. We said, like, okay, we have general applications or general purpose AI that supports various use cases that we didn't get into, like whatever, cancer research and from whatnot. And then we have applications that generate output, that synthetic content that are substitutive, and the term substitutive came up. And I think that this distinction between general applications and applications that or use that generates content that is substitutive in a certain way, that this applies to both categories. So the preferences for from the rights holder communities, I think, are pretty simple. So AI models or use should not be substitutive, and content should be discoverable. So I think we should keep that in mind, both the charter, and we could keep in mind how that affects the business and the livelihood of creators or society in general. You mentioned it before. And I think by saying that creators do not want and cannot understand the implication, that is a bit like putting away these points. So I think the solution could potentially be like introducing, like what has been mentioned, like in the previous by Sonia, if I understood you correctly, to have like a category that includes search, that says, okay, you have an engine that does what it needs to do, and then you have synthetic content that is created as a use or as an output of that. And if that distinction analog to the first category of the model training, I think it's even simpler for creators to understand what choices can be made.
For me, I'm going to put a little nuance on interpreting the charter. It's primarily there to scope our work, make sure that we stay on task. It's not a guarantee that we will do certain things. At the end of the day, the IETF is about producing quality technical documents. And so that has to be feasible. But that doesn't mean that we have to just accept assertions that something can't be implemented or something like that. But we do need to consider those factors.
It's surprisingly clear.
So we still have a number of people on the queue, so I'm just going to ask people to be brief, and I think we're going to lock the queue pretty soon. Sebastian, and then Christian. Sorry, Christopher.
Sebastian is now.
Yeah, where's Christopher? There he is.
Hi, I'll be brief. I just want to say I agree with some of the questions Sonia has and what Sebastian is saying. I'm kind of struggling with what Aaron is saying. Is there not a way to say yes to search but no to AI training for any purpose whatsoever? Maybe AI training for search, yes, right? And I thought that's why we had that Gen AI subcategory. I like the idea of returning to the purpose of the charter, and part of that is, understanding what publishers and rights holders want. And I think we have an opportunity here to understand. There's at least two publishers in the room, and a lot of people that understand what they want already. So if there's any question about that, here we are. And maybe focusing more on the what and the why versus the how, and working from there would be useful, and more purpose and usage rather than technical capability. I was curious of how Gary's idea of opt out of AIO and AIM would be expressed in this draft, how that might work.
To the robot.
Thank you. This is Tim the Robot. I just wanted to caution us against policing and patronizing users and consumers of this vocabulary. I am pleased to see us pursuing kind of technical accuracy, but I do see us drifting into knowing what is best for the interests of others. And earlier, someone said something about categories being understood by those expressing them and those consuming them. And I think that should be our bar, not predicting what users will or will not want. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim, about that's well said. Tom.
This is just a very brief or operational point about note taking, which is, I'll say it quickly. So some people speak very, very quickly. The conversation moves on very quickly, and whoever's taking the notes is basically rendered mute in these discussions, which I think is kind of a bit skewed, not really that fair. It takes them out of the conversation. So I think, I think some others would like it if we could use a transcription tool and then the scribe maybe guides that and make sure there's no mistakes made. So rather than trying to write everything themselves, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I understand that frustration. I will take that back, but I think we need to get some agreement from leadership.
That's totally fine. I just wanted to.
But you don't need to take narrative minutes. You should need to take decision on details.
Yeah, to be clear, and I think we have this written down somewhere, narrative minutes are not necessary.
So in fact, you could be taking notes at all, basically, because we made notes.
We haven't made any decisions.
We actually have empty notes at this point.
And do remember, the session's being recorded. So yeah, and sorry if that wasn't clear earlier, but yeah, that's not the expectation.
That's great.
That's not the practice. So
indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Shresh.
Yeah, so I think like Tim Robot also said it, and I said it yesterday too. So like as long as we are clearly communicating the preference and that everybody who consumes it understands what like somebody's communicating, there's other stuff that happens outside the IETF that has to do with that. Like I think the thing, like Krishna talked about it like yesterday. There's like webmaster guidelines like that, like Bing has like some search tools, and like Google has it as well. I think it's called Search Essentials or something, right? Like where they explain like how like whatever you do in your robots or text affects like how you are discovered, right? Like how you're formed and everything. I think that's what we should shoot for, like to clear expression of preferences and like making it clear to people who consume it. And I know there's like more to it, but I'm not sure it's like ours to solve.
I think I want to maybe walk back some of my pessimism, but it might indeed be useful. Like I think there is some degree maybe we didn't have enough time this morning to walk through some of these issues, and so in the line of what's the best use of the remaining time, it might actually be a good idea to have that group and maybe expand it with 2 or 3 others. For example, there were more people from pure player companies in that group. Let's figure out what makes sense here and have people sit down again and try to see how this can be turned, because we were also relatively abruptly interrupted and couldn't even like have a sort of round at the end to say, okay, do we feel or put pins in what we want to take forward of that? And if we're not doing this during the remainder of the day, like it will be really hard to carry that on between now and any subsequent meetings.
Great. Mike? No?
Sorry. I think hearing this discussion this morning, it's extremely clear to me at least in my tired head, that which is in brick mode right now, that focusing on output is the primary way to get around a lot of the issues that are being discussed. The fundamental reason why I'm saying this is if we say that you want to opt into search, but then dictate the mechanisms through which that happen, that essentially blocks you from expressing a fair preference. So instead, if you just focus on the kinds of output that you want out of the system, it is a lot easier than to dictate the underlying mechanisms, which are fairly opaque to many people. So I just want to see if, in my head, I have this right. It seems like a path forward is to actually try and focus more on the output options that we want, as opposed to whether it's called search or whether it's called something else. I think that would get us out of some of this cyclical arguments that we are hearing. Just a thought.
The keys club and Irene, if you want to briefly say something. Sure. Can someone get her up?
I think the challenge with focusing only on output methods is that this is only a way that the publishers can specify what they want to happen with the output of the model, but they cannot specify what they don't want to happen with the output of the model. And that's why you also need the sort of like specifying the purpose of the model to strengthen your data. Because with output, you control like, is it used in the right way, my data? But it doesn't control for misuse. Like, are you using my data to sort of like serve other purposes where I'm not being compensated or like I'm not being sort of like attributed and things like this? So you sort of like need to control for both use and misuse. And that's why I think that proposition about like the purpose of the model being like search or other generative use cases is possibly like one way forward.
Okay, so it seems like it might be good to take a prolonged break and let that self-organized group have a little more discussion. That's, again, an informal mechanism. It's not even an official design team. So the folks who participated in that, do you feel like it would be beneficial if you had other voices or other kinds of voices joining you?
Maybe we need to have a little higher amount of people who are in there to.
Okay, why don't we do this? Let's go to break until.
Well, in general, yes.
In general, yes.
Not about
Right.
excluding people, but like maybe
Right.
like have other, because like there is a, if it becomes too big, like then we're.
That's the tension. Yes, you don't want to be exclusive, but if it becomes too large, then it's unproductive. So there's a balance to be had there. We're just asking everyone to keep that in mind. And again, this group is not making decisions for the rest of us, so feel like you need to make sure that you're, they're just to be represented. But
Also, everyone else could self-organize small groups and come up with
This is
competing
it.
proposals, and then we could all discuss various ideas.
that was my next point. It's not exclusive. It's other people can have those discussions. So let's break until 11:30, so just a bit more than an hour. We'll come back. We'll see if those folks have made any progress, and that'll take about half an hour. And then we'll take a half an hour. Oh, no, sorry, we can take about an hour on that. And then we'll take half an hour to do next steps, planning and contemplation. Make sense? So back in the room and ready to discuss at 11:30, please. So remote folks, we've got people just starting to filter back into the room. We'll probably start in 5 minutes or so, I'd say. Thank you for your patience.
Are there any remote folks?
Okay, let's get everyone sitting down, please. Let's get started again. We're already fairly significantly over time. Folks in the back.
Some miscommunication happened at the last minute.
They're trying to clarify that? Okay.
I have an idea that I can help. Maybe.
Okay.
30
more seconds.
Shame. You are definitively Martin Thompson now?
No, I'm all of them.
All the Thompsons. Okay.
Oh, wow.
All right. So it's 11:38. We have an hour and 15 minutes-ish, and we need to spend at least 15 or 20 at the end talking about next steps. So our ad hoc, Warren, thanks. Our ad hoc group went off and has no official standing, but hopefully is maybe giving us something to consider to make progress. Anything to report, to bring back to us? Who wants to talk?
Aaron has a fun to that end.
Okay.
Got it. Okay, we're now passing the buck.
I heard my name.
Okay, so this is an interesting one. So let me try to unpack it all. So we talked about the AI output thing that we discussed yesterday, that this morning we had made no significant inroads on. And I think we made some pretty significant progress on trying to clarify what it is that we can do to scope in a sensible fashion. I think there's a couple of things that were unclear when we first sort of embarked on that exercise as to how it would interact with what Krishna had proposed and in terms of the functions that were there. And I think we sort of clarified that this is as proposed in the pull request that was up, a close approximation of what was in the exact text match thing. And we were calling this what's in the pull request is a search category. I think it's a bad label. It doesn't, because it doesn't correspond to how it actually operates. So we started calling it the Lederhosen category, and that Lederhosen category is effectively a refinement of the AI output category that has further stipulations on it, which was essentially the exact text match things that Krishna's draft describes. And so from there, we had a number of problems to resolve, and I won't try to summarize all of the discussion that happened there. There was a lot of back and forth on the various points, but I think the general sense that I got was that the folks involved in that were comfortable that this would align fairly well with the interests of the people who want to just appear in search and don't want to also appear in things like overviews or summaries or the output of a chatbot or all of those sorts of other things like that. And so they could use that effectively to do that. We also got the sense from the folks involved in implementing those products that while it is not a match for what they presently do, it seems plausible at least to be confirmed that such a thing would be implementable in some way in those products if that preference were to be expressed. There were some cautions associated with that. There obviously no one can make any commitments about products, and also no commitments about sort of the granularity of how those products deal with the preference expressions. If the preference expressions are sort of too granular or not in a shape that fit within the requirements of those products, it may be necessary for them to essentially exclude more content than people would otherwise prefer to be excluded from participation in those products. So if you imagine, I have a web page. Every second word can be used in the generation of a search result, but all the other ones can't, which is actually something you can do presently with Bing, according to my understanding.
The alternate word is not.
Right, and you can imagine all sorts of opportunities for problems. That is something that being presently allows you to do in terms of controlling snippet use. It may be that they decide that they have a broader scope of things that they ignore as a result of someone doing those sorts of things, just from a pure product feasibility and implementation standpoint. So there's a couple of caveats on that, but I think we generally got to a good place with that. Toward the very end, we talked about the problem that was identified yesterday, where in order to build and deploy one of these sorts of products, you train and use an AI model, and the training part was in conflict with our definition of the AI training categories and whatnot. And so the conclusion there was to see, I don't think this is right, but we'll yeah,
Forget about the nesting.
Forget about the nesting. We'll leave that for the moment. So what we decided there was that in defining those categories, we would define them to include any training of models necessary to produce the system itself, or to operate the system itself. So if you are looking to do the Lederhosen thing, which is the sort of rough approximation of I want to appear in search, then the entity that's providing the search application would be able to train models using that content, would be able to feed the content into those models as long as it met the stipulations in there, which is that if the content is used, it appears with links associated with it. And, snippets, not synthetic things based on the content of the article, for instance. Now, I understand there's still a bunch of questions about that. There is text in a pull request that covers most of that, aside from the question of associated training.
That's a pull request on that current.
There's a pull request on the repository that's there. It's currently badly labeled. It's not as badly labeled as Lederhosen, but it is badly labeled. But it doesn't include the associated training thing. I think the other piece to the discussion that we had, and you'll see it on the screen, is rather than talk about AI training, we felt because the AI output category included the associated training necessary to accomplish that, that would cover a lot more of the use cases than we needed. And the main concern that people had was around the generation of foundational models, and having that and retaining that as a separate category was something that people felt fit more with the expectations of folks involved in doing that. So to sort of sum up, there is a sort of three main concepts being introduced here, all of which are variations on the things that you understand to have existed in previous documents. So the AI output is a much more narrowly defined AI inference, AI use category, and it concentrates on the observable outputs of a system rather than its internal workings. The Lederhosen one adds additional stipulations on that use, but it's basically the same category. And so I'm of the view that it's a nesting. It seems like others are not, and that was the point of confusion just at the start of the session here. But that has those additional stipulations that the concept can only be basically used excerpts verbatim from it, and if you use those excerpts, you link back to the original source, and then a shift in the AI training side of things to foundational models as the primary thing of concern, rather than look at the general AI training class of use. And so the distinction between foundational and general purpose and generative is something that I think we can probably talk about a little bit if people are curious about the distinction between those terms. But the general sense of the folks involved was that foundational is the thing that cuts to both what people want to be able to express in terms of preferences and in terms of how people conceive the models in practice. So foundational models are the big expensive ones that you burn thousands of trees to produce, and millions, sorry. The sort of generative is talking about a specific capability that all of those things have, but it's not necessarily the defining characteristic that we want to focus on. And the current text in the document talks about general purpose, and that has specific meaning in certain jurisdictions, and is a narrower conception of what we have with foundational. And we didn't feel like that was a good fit for this, particularly because it had the potential to trigger some of the, activate those neurons that relate to specific legislation in various places. So, questions time.
Is it actually a PR, Martin? Because I don't see it.
There is a pull request on the current drafts that does AI output and search, which you can substitute in your head later, Hosen. It does not include the additional stipulation about associated training, which I have a draft of, but I haven't put it up on that map.
Does it have general purpose and have foundation in there?
It doesn't have the foundational piece either.
Okay, so perhaps looking at that paragraph is not the most useful thing to do.
So that will give you the definition as we presently understand it for AI output and later Hosen. It doesn't give you the rest of the stuff. I think foundational, is something we're going to do.
So, one question I had is in the later Hosen stuff, right? The dynamic stuff that Ed showed is not going to be covered, right? Because it does actually transform the text, and it's not just snippets, even though it has some rules.
So the categorization, the search categories that we saw yesterday, unanswered question, and I suspect that may be a question that Google can answer for themselves within the framework of this, and maybe they'll need to answer specifically that question in their own documentation rather than have us define it for them. I think that may be the most sensible approach that we can take, the boundaries of these things, because obviously that product is going to evolve and the standard is not, and we can't be sort of responsible for getting all the details of this right for all the specific products that are out there.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Felix?
Yeah, perhaps to add to that. So one effect of collapsing the question of do you link back and the question of do you only use exact quotes into one category is exactly that. There is a possibility to make a design where you can address those separately, where you say basically you have to link back regardless of whether you use an exact quote or not. In this design, this is not possible. You either say you have to link back and you have to limit yourself to exact quotes. We could do it differently, but it's always a trade-off between complexity and nuance of controls.
I'm totally fine with that. As I said this morning, I do understand this, webmaster guide or search essential stuff is probably going to cover this in more detail, like setting this means. So I'm totally okay with that. I just wanted to understand what that covered, because either Hosen is not a very descriptive name.
So as we talk about this, I guess there are two things in my mind. One is that, there's obviously a lot of context embedded in this proposal. And if we want it to succeed, not everyone who's been involved in these discussions is in this room. So we need to communicate with those people extremely well to give it the best chance of convincing people that this is the right direction to go in. So I'm looking for the folks working on that PR to continue to iterate. And what I'm hoping to do is to get us to a point where it's fully formed PR that addresses all of these things and is a step change in the content of the draft. And that takes me to the second thought, which is right now we have a draft which does not reflect the current state of discussions in the group. And we have external parties starting to make assumptions about it or build upon it. And so at some point it's going to be more productive to have the draft reflect the state of discussion, even if we don't have consensus upon those specific words. And I'm looking to understand when we think that is, because if we're too preemptive about changing the draft, then people might, read too much into that. But we don't want the draft to be stale. We want it to reflect our current state of discussion without saying, yes, this is consensus, we're locking you into this. And so, in the back of my mind, I'm like, if between now and Montreal, we can get this PR developed to the state where it communicates clearly enough that the group becomes comfortable saying, yes, let's incorporate that because that reflects the state of our discussion without declaring consensus on it, that would be a positive step forward in my mind. I'd like to hear reactions to that.
What's Montreal?
Montreal is IETF in November.
Oh,
1 month.
Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah. First of all, would people be comfortable with that, of assuming that PR becomes more fully formed and complete and well explained, that the editors would go ahead and incorporate that, as long as we're very clear as working group, this is not a declaration of consensus, this is just allowing us to focus our discussion.
Yes, I'm happy to proceed in whatever ways people think best in this, but I do think that if we're starting to head in this direction, it would be helpful to have that in drafts somewhere, so that we can all sort of point at the thing that we're talking about.
Right. The alternative is just another idea.
The question, I guess, is whether or not there's any significant number of people that think that this is fundamentally not the direction we should be heading in.
Right.
And so I realize that with the very limited information that we've given you, that's an unreasonable ask right now. I think a lot of people will have to go off and have a look at what words are being written and think about them. So I expect that over the course of the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to get close to that.
That's what I think.
But the sort of timing I'm thinking about here is there's a draft submission deadline ahead of the meeting in like 2 or 3 weeks. And if we can get text in a reasonable shape for that date, I would like to be able to say, unless absent some serious objections on the content or new information, then we'll merge that into the document and say this is the thing we'll try to anchor our discussion around.
That's a little more aggressive than I was thinking. I was thinking we probably wouldn't incorporate it until the Montreal timeframe, but
yeah, whatever works for people.
If people are comfortable with that, I think that's fine. Alternatively, it could just be a separate, individual ID.
Yeah, and I fully intend to take this in a couple of pieces. I think the foundational model training thing will require some interesting definitional work that I think we can separate largely from the right-hand side of this diagram. And so I wanted to do it in a couple of pieces that sort of move independently. But other than that, I think there's that. The other part of this that I think is necessary is understanding where this doesn't completely cover the concerns that people have. And I think there's a number of things that come up in the discussions around this. One of the sort of primary features, I think, of Krishna's draft is that there's finer grained controls associated with that. And to what extent we bring that into the discussion. I mean, these are just Boolean labels, essentially, just like everything else, yes or no. And Krishna proposed something far more precise, this many words, this many seconds of video, those sorts of things. I want to understand how much that is important for us to involve in this process, or that we can say defer decisions about that, or rely on the existing machinery for some amount of time before we bring it in, or how people would like to proceed with those sorts of questions.
I guess, given our history, I would like to get to a point where we can ask the group, does anyone believe that this proposal is worse than what we currently have? And to ask that question, we need to have something to throw them at. So maybe a separate draft is a good thing.
I did have a slightly different way of think what I'll just throw it out and we see if it makes sense, right?
Just put it on your head. What? Put it on your head.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, he doesn't know.
No.
Oh,
Sorry.
yeah. So I'm just thinking if you can kind of make an editor copy with the changes, so people can actually look at a draft, but without having a separate draft or assumption that it's like going to draft with the consensus. Maybe that would probably be the best bet. Like so, I don't know.
Just maybe a different branch, and
Sure.
because the repo does that for you, doesn't it?
So because I was thinking of taking this in multiple bites, it wouldn't do that naturally, but we can put that together if that would help.
All right. All right. You'll figure this out. Let's not be too preemptive about it. I don't want to ruffle feathers the wrong way on it. Let's have a little more.
So I think this is probably a good opportunity for folks like Elaine there to ask questions, and well, those of us who are involved in this process can do our best to try to answer them, or at least we can note the problems so that we can set them aside to discuss. I think the first thing we want to do here is help people understand what's going on here, and then identify issues that we might need to address with where we're headed, and maybe not try to solve those issues at this point because we don't have a whole lot of time left in the session.
No, we don't have much information.
But, and sort of focus on the first part, and then in the next few weeks we can focus more on this, on the sort of problems and whatnot.
And you know, optimistically, if the folks who helped design this could make themselves available, perhaps a couple of phone calls to answer questions or socialize the ideas, that might help too. Elaine.
Thanks. I have several questions. I'll start with one simple one. I think it's simple. You mentioned, Martin, that these are nested. I think that's what you were saying, but they're shown as different size silos. Could you explain that?
There was
they were not
a
nested.
bunch of debate about this point, and so I don't think it's completely resolved. My perspective on this one is that this lederhosen category, which is the approximate, the 10 blue links category, is effectively a subset of the AI output category and would appear nested, but that's not something that is entirely clear. I think part of the reason that it's unclear is that we made some very late changes to both of them, and so it may not stay that way. So I don't consider that set in stone in terms of this proposal either. Magic.
It's just like we were out of time to sort of like people were leaving the table and we couldn't resolve that question if it should be nested or not. There's advantages to it being nested in the sense that it is, and there's, anyway, we need to continue this.
But not always.
Well, there's a bunch of other questions. Elaine, more questions?
I'll ask one more and then let Caleb ask something. Did the group think about when there are cases where it might be confusing between the foundational model training and AI output and associated training categories?
Oh yes, we did. that was one of the more interesting discussions here. So it turns out that if we're going to put multiple categories of use out here, that all of them have some component of training associated with them, and maybe even some amount of foundational model training necessary to build one of those later categories, then there's very high risk that someone could reach conclusions about how the system is intended to operate that don't align with reality. And so there was much discussion, again, which we didn't have time to resolve, around how this could be best presented to avoid creating confusion about what it meant. But I think the general sense was that we had the shape right. It's just that we needed to get the communication very crisp around all of these things, because yes, there are components of training involved in all of these things, and there's no distinction in that sense. Yeah,
Yeah, and
the foundational model training is sort of a component of the others in a sense, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's confusing, and so I think we'll have to spend a bit of time trying to work through that. Yeah.
yeah, I think it is. It bleeds into the other ones for sure.
Caleb.
Start.
Yeah, two quick things. One is, does associated training mean necessary training for those functions? And then my other question is, since there are only 8 permutations here, would it be helpful to anyone other than me if someone, maybe me, just kind of listed them all out and they tried to figure out what each set of preferences means?
Yeah, so the text that I have right now, which is very tentative and I put together in like 2 minutes while trying to maintain a conversation, does use the word necessary for training. So it doesn't really allow the possibility that the training that you used further that particular goal might then be, dual purposed and used for other purposes. That again is something that we should probably talk about, because I understand that there are aspects of these systems that maybe don't work that way, and maybe that is not a reasonable request to be making of people building those systems, and we can talk about that. The other question you asked was, well, can we just enumerate them? I think that's probably a really useful paper exercise. It's probably not a great use of our time during this meeting, but it would be really nice for someone to put together a web page saying, here's my understanding of what it means to say A, B, C, D, all of the 8 different permutations here, and have people throw arrows at that and sort of see whether or not that stands up to sort of scrutiny. But I think that's a useful contribution if you were willing to do that. So that'd be good.
Sonia, is there a microphone down that way?
I think I might.
So I think associated training in the other 2 categories is really confusing. Do we need it? I'm wondering kind of what the need is. Oh yeah, sorry.
I'm going to see this one.
Okay.
You can add that.
Yeah, so this was the concern that Erin raised yesterday, if you recall. So the idea that you can't build and operate one of these systems if you're not able to operate AI training using the content that is the subject of the search, for instance. And so we wanted to make sure that we were able to have someone express a preference that this be possible. So I want my content to appear in search results, which means accepting the fact that there's some amount of model training going on based on that content. This is how search engines operate. They take that content and they use it and they train based on the content, and that's necessary to produce a search product. We wanted to make sure that that preference just to allow search to happen included the training necessary for that, because otherwise there was a possibility that you would have, in the old taxonomy, you would have, I would like search to be possible with this content, but I would not like it possible for a model to be trained on the content. So this is the AI training no, search yes scenario. That was an impossibility. That we established that as an impossibility yesterday, right?
Okay, so
we're trying to address that by saying, if you say yes to search or whatever we call it, then you're not saying no to search inadvertently by virtue of saying that you don't want someone to build a foundational model using your content.
See, I think the risk is moving away from the benefit of having kind of the opt-out defined in the context of the output and how you want to describe the output, because we start to then stray into the implementation necessary to deliver that output, whether that's in the context of training or anything else. And then you have to positively opt into all of the implementation details necessary to create the output. And I think it, A, unnecessarily complicates it, B, creates the problem that you're trying to avoid by opting out of something that you don't want to opt out of. Whereas if we're just defining it in the context of the outcome, that's
what we're doing.
But the training isn't the outcome. The training is what you're saying is a necessary implementation detail to remain in the outcome. And I think that's where you start to stray into that.
No, so
finding
that's not at all the intent. So the idea is to say we are focusing on the observable outcome system, which is that it appears in the output of the system, and we don't care about the internals of the system. We're explicitly saying that if the system in its internals involves some amount of AI training, then don't worry about that. We're very much getting away from trying to talk about the internals of the system and how it's implemented.
So it's a clarification, not definition.
It's a clarification more than anything else. We're saying the definition of this thing is about the outcomes that you can observe from the process rather than how it operates inside.
So it's more to address if I've opted out of generative foundation model training,
yes,
that's not going to impact this particular category.
That's right, it's a very separate thing under this taxonomy.
I mean, it does present a bit of a problem because I guess there are going to be examples where yeah, okay, let me think that through. But no, that's a helpful clarification. I guess the other point I wanted to make is that in what we're referring to as Krishna's draft, which the group draft that was that we've been looking at does have very specific details around what those outputs are and whether that's useful to retain. I absolutely think we do need to be thinking in the context of what we actually do want to see in those outcomes, because otherwise they become very abstract and difficult to pin down. And I think that was one of the benefits of that specification, and that it gave us kind of clear guidance as to what and how to implement those controls.
I think you'll find modular wording, the intent is to be even clearer than what was in that document and largely aligned with what that document was trying to do. In fact, if not identical.
Because I think some efforts to maybe abstract away so that it covers other modalities might not necessarily be useful. Maybe we want to kind of include specifics around other modalities, potentially, just as we're thinking about it.
Rather than speculate on it right now, maybe I suggest what you can do is look at the text that's being proposed and tell me, in specific terms, what alternative text you would like to see, and or what specific problems you can foresee based on the shape of that text. So rather than trying to litigate that now, I think this is part of your homework.
Yeah, no, happy to do that. And sorry, last comment, I guess, shall we start a new ID? Because I think there are, a number of issues that we spotted in some of the other proposals that, rather than developing it based on the initial adopted proposal, should we develop a new one so that we can start to build it from kind of where we see consensus rather than kind of pulling at things where there are not necessarily points of consensus. Does that make sense?
I think I'm concerned about proliferation of drafts at this point. We've got a lot of things flying around, and so if we can reduce that, again, it's not about identifying a draft that has consensus in it yet. I think that's premature, obviously, from recent discussions. It's more about this is the current topic of discussion, and this is the least bad thing we have so far. And our topic of discussion has pretty much moved on from fullest in the current draft.
Can I suggest then that we build out from what's in Krishna's draft, because it's a bit narrower, and I think then we've got a basis to build.
Let's take that offline. Procedurally, that's a lot more difficult than what we're talking about here.
So the observation that I had here was that out of the end of this discussion, the delta between what's in the adopted drafts and what is being proposed here is actually pretty small. The definitions that we have for categories of use are a relatively small portion of that document.
Right.
And what is being suggested here aligns very well with the architecture of all of that.
Right.
And so I don't think that this is as much of a problem for people to manage as it might be to say pick up something like a completely different draft.
And we still have the other text like the introduction, sort of outtakes and so forth.
Yeah,
And
there's
it's
a lot of
associated
invested effort.
which is captured in the state of the discussion.
Yeah.
We'll settle with that, it's fine.
Yeah, so Mark, like, I think we should probably lean towards publishing a new version of the draft, even though it doesn't have consensus, and probably put in like a line in the beginning saying like,
It's up with its own.
whatever, right?
I-
Because like, I'm
Sure.
worried, like, we don't want to go building multiple parallel tracks.
I agree, but I don't also want to surprise people who haven't been this right. Chris.
Yes, so going back to the discussion that we were having in the subgroup. So I think whether this is successful, potentially, like it all really hinges on the definitions that we attach to the word lederhosen and words like foundational. So Mark's right that like we do have some like important definitional work to be done here. Like I think the AI output category, like if we're thinking about lederhosen representing what we think of currently as traditional search, then the AI output category may also have application in that context. In a world where traditional search includes some AI-based summarization or a conversational interface. So there's in that sort of situation, I think this is giving publishers the kind of controls perhaps that they're looking for. And so the definitions need to be very tightly scoped such that, if publishers end up having to say yes to AI training because that's part and parcel of what we call lederhosen, then we would not want that to be applied like more broadly in other contexts. So I think broadly, like this is going in a reasonable direction, but I think everything sort of hinges really on the definitions that we come up with and the scope that ends up associated with them.
Okay.
Yes, me. I mean, get that. Where is the one other side? So, I mean, first, just to check your intentions. These names do not convey anything, correct? Namely, you call the middle thing banana, and the first thing apple, and the last thing lederhosen, and you're going to have operational definitions of what each of those mean, right?
Yeah, I think those labels that we have here are an intuition more than.
That sounds great. I'm just making sure that is the intention.
Yeah.
And so and similarly, I should interpret if I say initial model training, yes. Lederhosen, no. That like means I guess that I can do ChatGPT, but I can't do search, right? And so I might say that, but like that's a thing you might say that might be coherent. This question of the nesting between output and lederhosen, I guess I don't quite understand. Like, isn't that a question which is derivable from the definitions? Like, once we understand the definitions mean, then we'll either know if lederhosen form a nesting or will not, or will not.
Yeah, so that's why I have concluded that they are nested, because the way that I have it presently written, it makes sense for them to be nested. Now, that's again an unresolved question, but yes, you're right. The definition will determine that. And because we made some late changes about the associated training thing, we originally only had the associated training thing on the lederhosen one. That's why we end up with this diagram.
Sure. I mean, I think this does have to clearly empower the training, otherwise it falls apart. I mean, the existence of financial model training means that these exceptions have to have a training thing associated with them. Those are work, right? Right. When we opened the discussion on Tuesday with a long discussion of the catch-all category, right? This is this foundation model training is much narrower category than than a catch-all, right? They'll only be a cross-state category,
Right. So this does not, we're not saying anything about the existence of a top-level category on this slide or in this discussion at all. We're just talking about these particular shifts that we're talking about. So that question about a top-level category is still unresolved.
Okay.
In any of this. Yeah.
And it still has other issues on it. Yeah.
Correct. Well, I have one more question, but maybe I don't. Like 2 seconds.
So my my best attempt at trying to interpret what it would mean if you say data was a no, AI output yes, is that you may use the content in an AI output, but you may not link back to it, and you may not quote from it. I don't think that's necessarily logical, because really these are, I mean.
Well, is it may not, I think it's actually, you may not link back to it and quote from it.
Exactly.
Like you can do either, but not both.
Can I finish my thought?
Sure.
That's why in the proposal we had yesterday, these were two independently addressable conditions. And I'm not 100% sure that it does make sense to collapse them exactly for the problem that you just addressed, that you can only address them together, which in a yes-no situation is confusing. So it is possible to separate them out and kind of treat the question of whether you may link independently from the question whether you have to quote specifically. But for now, this is how I interpret how it would work if you say that there was no AI output yes.
So I think that's not quite right. Okay. I don't think that's the correct interpretation here. So the later hosting category stipulates additional conditions that are necessary for that one. And so if you were going to say no in that category, but yes in the other one, I think that's a nonsensical thing to be saying. I think that this may be the nonsensical case, which is to say, if you say yes to AI output, then those conditions on use don't exist. And so you can quote or not and link or not. And so this is where we have a little bit of a problem to work through. But I think that's to Caleb's point. We need to walk through, make sure the entire thing makes sense, and then when it doesn't, as I suspect that one doesn't, we will need to work out what it is that we say in that circumstance. And it may just be that if you say no in that category and yes in the higher level category, then the no means nothing. Just ignore the no. But we'll have to work through that one. I don't think that one's a major blocker for making progress here.
Chris? Yeah, so thinking about the AI output yes, data and no category, like that might have a use case, like in the kind of thing that Len just described around sort of style transfer and so on, where it is an AI it's an AI generated output that's based on a pre-existing trained model, but it's not in any way in the context of what we think of as a search application. So I do think there are valid uses for it. And this kind of comes a little bit back to the echo made yesterday about having the use cases of this. I think having something written down that kind of enumerates the different potential applications, helps us evaluate against them.
Elaine.
Thanks. I'm curious about the choice of going with foundational model versus Gen AI training. I can guess why some people in the group or all the people in the group preferred that, but instead of guessing, I just wanted to ask what the benefits of making that shift are, and if the views were mixed in the group.
Anyone want to answer that?
Go on, give it a go, Paul.
I know it's hard to answer. Like there was reasons for not using general purpose AI because it's too closely linked to a specific legal regime and a general understanding that foundational model, general purpose AI models are sort of functionally equivalent anyway, and so use the more neutral term, if you will, in that sense. Moving away, and I don't think there was mixed views expressed in that group. The other thing why we moved away from generative AI training with foundational model training, I think, was that it is, we essentially collapsed the train all AI and general purpose AI into one category, and it felt like by collapsing that we are covering something that is slightly bigger than just like the previous definition of generative AI models. So that felt more appropriate, but it wasn't, there was no, it followed relatively quickly and relatively naturally from the conversation. I don't know, like people may please disagree with my description if I got this wrong.
Can I make a comment as I understood it as to why it had been changed? I think that the kind of distinction between the AI models that were used in the context of search versus what people wanted to opt out of seemed to be, you know, why we've drawn the line there. And I think that the comments in relation to potentially smaller, you know, models being used in search are relevant. And I'm kind of looking at foundation model as being, you know, more to do with generative foundation models in that context.
So I think part of the discussion was foundational models are sufficiently large, and generative is one aspect of a foundational model, but the foundational models include a number of other aspects. This also essentially means that if you are just training a small spam detection model, then you could theoretically just not worry about this particular preference, and you can go ahead and train the spam model. So in that sense, the foundational model, as is defined right now in the larger literature, is a sufficiently large model with enough diversity of data sets that would dictate a pretty large scale. At least that's kind of how I understood it.
And were there site owners that had a view on this?
So if Chris or Christopher have an opinion on this, what's the question? Sorry. I think the question from Elaine was, I think the question from Elaine was if the site owners and publishers represented in that small group have an opinion on this or an answer to her question.
Which question? The question being what?
The question being why the move from generative AI models to foundational models, but like, I don't know, I'm paraphrasing.
Yes.
The way that I understood it was because
from what I understood, you couldn't separate generative AI training from search, or AKA lead pros, and so that's why we separated those two categories, right? So it's associated training because generative AI training included too many things. So
So yeah, just to add to that, I think the way it was explained is that a generative model can have multiple purposes, some of which are not what we sort of conceive of as generative, so they can produce other forms of output. So focusing on the generative nature isn't necessarily the thing that's sort of most sort of definitional or distinctive about them. Like, that was my understanding of where the conversation got to. I do appreciate that perhaps creates a concern among users of the in the publishing community as to, like, well, what are we saying yes to, and does that actually prevent the thing that we're most worried about? So I think, you know, there's language that we need to be added to, you know, to sort of convey that. But that's and I'm not saying I agree with this, but that's my recollection of like how we ended up with moving towards a foundational model as opposed to generative as the definition of the kind of models.
Maybe one addition to this, like one of the and it speaks to Ecker's point, one of the earliest things we agreed in this group is really not about the names of these categories, it's about like how we define them, right? Like this needs to speak from the definition of the categories, what they include and what they do not include, and the names are secondary in this. They could be called, I don't know what the examples were, banana, apple, and dittos. Fall is what, as long as they are well defined.
See from the chair that there is fitting the IETF external model.
I'm sorry, it's been a lot of thinking. I've been very constructive for so much of this.
No, you're exhibiting classic IETF behavior very quickly. Yeah, well, you're one of us. Timid robot.
I'm Timid Robot. Just want to talk about names some more. So my understanding is that the Lederhosen category is a requirement applying to the AI output category, requirement of specific constraints on the output and how it is handled vis-a-vis the links. So would it make more sense, kind of as we're thinking about this, to instead of just calling it Lederhosen, to say requires Lederhosen? I think that potentially situates it more accurately.
Yep. Edgar. Yeah, I know. I think we're
Mike got this.
heading towards that part of the day where people are losing a little cohesion.
It comes earlier and earlier.
It does.
So, I mean, as I said, I was joking about the names, but I think given this discussion, we probably should invent some fake names. So in the chat, Felix and I discussed like what the implications were if you say FMT equals yes and nothing else, right? And the consensus I understood in the chat was that meant you could feed it in your model and you could generate any output you wanted. You could generate any output you wanted from that model, but you couldn't use it for effectively grounding.
Provided the other thing is that.
Yeah, yes, all you so wait, so you're gonna say other ones are well, the other ones are in some default, in some unknown state. Like all I say is FMT equals yes. And I say nothing else, right? And then the question is whether I use it for grounding is an unknown state, or it's in a or it's in an unknown state.
I mean, I can try to answer that, but I worry it sort of gets us sidetracked because the way that the draft was previously looking at unknown was that this vocabulary is supposed to work in both an opt-in and both an opt-out context. So it would really depend on the context. I don't think that's particularly helpful to go down right now, but saying foundational model training, yes, means you may use this context for training a foundational model. And I think that implies that that foundational model can then also be used within the capabilities that it has. And yes, that may include creating outputs that were informed by the training data. And I know you don't like that, but that's how I understand it.
I don't dislike that. I just like that it's clear.
I think it's clear.
Well, it's not clear if it's no. You just told me opt-in versus opt-out, so it's entirely unclear.
No. What it means if the other thing is set to unknown is unclear. If the other thing is set to no, then it's clear what it means.
Okay. All right. So, I mean, I don't object to that interpretation. I do object to the unclear thing. We can pick that up later, I suppose. So, as I understand these settings, there's no way to say you can use this for grounding, but you cannot train the model with.
You can use this for grounding, but you cannot train a foundational model on it. But there is no way of saying you can use this for grounding, but you may not train the model that is necessary to provide me with the output.
Yes.
Correct.
Okay.
So I'm looking at the time and perhaps the conversation. I think we're going to lock the queue. I think we need a more fully formed proposal that people can look at and take and talk to people without make real serious progress. So I don't want us to face plant on this discussion, but we have had some good clarifications in this. I'm also looking at the silliness of the names in the chat channel. I don't think that's an indication that we're talking about stuff. So Felix, was that your comment?
Yeah.
Okay. Suresh.
Yeah, so like the more and more I think about it, I think nesting is a bad idea. Like I think like Ecker's thing kind of sold me on it, because one of the things we think about nesting is the defaults falling through. If nothing is defined, because I think if you don't say anything about that last word, like that I won't name, it actually means that you can specify that, right? Like so if you said something about FMT, like things shouldn't cascade down, right? Like if and I think that's more the thing, other than even if we totally understand they're all proper subsets of each other, like if we specify nesting, it means that references fall through, and that's not maybe something we want. And even though it means like a painful thing of saying like what are the combinations that don't make sense, I think that's what we need to do.
Timid robot, the queue's locked, but if you have a very quick comment.
I just want to say regarding nesting, I think that it's important to note that the Lederhosen category as it's currently defined is a modification of AI output. And so there's a very real relationship between them. And so if they're not nested, we have to adequately describe and clarify that relationship.
So to be about I agree, but I think it's not something. So like we're kind of losing the seriousness a little bit here, but I do agree with you. I think if it's not nested, we need to do it, but I think that's probably the right way to go rather than nesting.
Okay. So I think the next steps are we need that proposal be more fully developed. We'll have a background discussion about the precise form that that'll take. I'm hearing suggestions that the name should be some form of nonsense, which might help people avoid misconceptions when they're reading that, at least while we're still forming the ideas. So take that on board, editors. And
it says Lederhosen right now.
Right, but from perhaps all the categories. I think that the main issue we have here is one of timing. The deadline for Montreal is coming up pretty soon. 20th. Yeah. We can ask the AD to manually publish after that. So I think we're just going to handle this dynamically and see how far we can get before Montreal. But if need be, we won't. You know, if we're seeing second thoughts, or if people are convinced that we need to keep the current text in the draft versus what's here, we'll push that out a little bit perhaps. But I think the bar really should be: is this an improvement on the current text? Not are we fully agreed to it? So that turns us to kind of that next steps planning discussion. As you know, we have Montreal. That meeting is both in person and online, but I think we requested 2 sessions, a 2-hour and a 1-hour, correct? And I think the agenda should be out. Is it tomorrow the agenda? The preliminary agenda's out?
No, I'll check.
Or is it, it's typically okay. So we'll continue to discuss. I think what we've discussed today. It is tomorrow. Okay, great. What we've discussed today will queue up the discussions in Montreal, and we'll continue that. I'm anticipating that we're going to perhaps try to hold an online only interim meeting in the December timeframe to keep the momentum up on the work. And then obviously we're going to need yet more meetings. I think this meeting we have made some progress. But we need to come to these meetings with more fully formed proposals. If we hold more meetings like this, I'm getting concerned. We need to get some more positive forward motion. So when we think about another interim meeting, we've talked about doing that in kind of a late January, early February timeframe. And so we wanted to get people's thoughts about not only precise dates to make sure we don't have any clashes. We did unfortunately have some clashes for some people this time that we couldn't avoid because it was arranged so quickly. There are process and logistical timelines that we have to follow. And so that must have been a good thing. We've been thinking, we've had a lot of meetings in Europe. So a lot of the folks who are affected by this work are elsewhere. One of the things that's been put up is perhaps we should try to meet in the United States, on the East Coast.
North America?
Or North America. I think there are a couple of challenges there that some people are concerned about going to some countries. If you have those concerns, especially about your own participation or your colleagues who might want to come, please come and talk to Suresh and I. But one of the things we've talked about is perhaps doing it in somewhere in New York, because there are a lot of people who have obvious interest in that work in that area. Another possibility would be someplace like Toronto. But frankly, in January and February, getting into and out of Toronto may be an issue. Melbourne. I am always happy to host in Melbourne. I'm sure Martin can make the onerous way down.
Oh, it's so tough.
But I don't know that we would get a good selection of folks wanting to come all the way to Melbourne. Although the weather will be good, I'll give you that. The other thing that people have suggested is someplace like Tokyo, which is kind of equidistant for a lot of people who are involved in this work. I'm not sure that's viable either. So I suspect what we're going to end up with is either something like New York or Toronto, or if we do go in Europe, it would be somewhere that was very accessible, like London, again, perhaps. So if folks have thoughts about that either way, or if folks can host a meeting in one of those places with facilities that are appropriate, I think you can see kind of this is the only problem I think we have here is this longest point narrow, but this is the kind of setup that we're looking for. Please come and talk to Suresh and I, and otherwise we'll pull the list for exact dates and suggest some locations.
Could it be next year?
We're talking January, early February or late January next year. Is what we're talking about for a hybrid meeting. For an online only interim, we're talking about probably the first couple of weeks in December, I would say. And that would be on the nature of probably a 2-hour meeting or something. The problem with that is about scheduling, because it's going to be the middle of the night for some people and early morning for other people and then the day for others.
So the deadline for the next draft is the end of this month, right?
20th of October, but we can vote. Okay, if we realize there's a draft coming, and we can talk to AD to get an override. So the AD needs to approve an override for a draft. It's kind of like more existing circumstances kind of thing. We can do it, but the question is, are we going to have something? That's the question.
And to be clear on location, if we can do something like New York, I think that is probably going to be best for the work. But if folks have real concerns about how it affects them or their colleagues, please come and tell us, and we will definitely take that into account. But it shouldn't be about vague concerns or strong feelings. It needs to be about I can't attend or someone can't attend because X.
So, I mean, just about the deadline. I mean, it is of course possible to waive the deadline.
Yeah,
but the purpose of that. I'm concurring. But the purpose of the deadline is to give people time to review the documents. And so it's for one thing to waive the deadline when it's a document that you just missed the window and it's also going to be the same. It's quite another when it's essentially a fresh document. So I really I guess I don't really care when it shows in the draft repository, but if GitHub isn't if you're screwing with GitHub and letting the thing airdrops like GitHub at the very last minute, that doesn't really help anybody, right? So, I'm happy to read the editor's copy. I don't really care if it's on the draft repository, but it's bad news if basically a brand new thing airdrops in the whole and nobody ever sees it until 2 days before.
Right. Yeah.
And that matters more, I think, if we're expecting to get a lot of work done on this topic in Montreal, and my expectation is that we are not. But it would, I don't think it's necessary for us to break the deadlines in this case. I think given the nature of this discussion, I think we can probably put something in place ahead of the deadline. And if we can't, then we can't, and we might try to do anything special.
The purpose here is really to socialize these ideas with concentrically larger groups of people and seeing if they stick, seeing if we have major issues that are identified with them. And again, it's not about consensus, it's about identifying that yes, this is the direction we need to go in.
Yeah, and also like since we have like 2 sessions scheduled in Montreal, so we can probably like take the first pass at like going through stuff in the first session, and we can like do a back and forth thing for the second session if we needed to. So it's another possibility.
There some purpose of 2 sessions, or a different purpose, or just they over?
There's like the slots come in pre-formed sizes, and we knew that we needed more than just a 2-hour slot, so we requested a 2-hour window.
Essentially.
Yeah, let's continue the discussion. Yeah.
But they might not be next to each other, Paul, if that's your question.
No.
Like, so it could
If
be
they're
like
different purposes, two different sessions, or what's the same?
No, it could be either way, like, but in our case, it's not. But there's groups that have like clear different things. So, like, for example, like if we had made for progress on this, we could have said the second session is for attachment, but obviously we're not there. So, like, it could be the same session continuing on that to answer those questions. Okay.
Elaine, you had a question?
Yes, what's the deadline? I know that the meeting, about the dates for the meeting in Montreal, but what is the deadline for people in the group?
So all we're talking about is that the IETF has a certain set of norms around. You need to, if you're going to talk about something in a meeting, you need to have the draft available to give people a chance to read it. It's not a deadline in the sense of publication or consensus or anything like that. It's just they close a publication queue for getting it up on the official repository of drafts, so that people have a chance to look at it. And things are, it's effectively you're freezing things before the meeting so that it's not changing while people are reviewing it before the meeting. That's all it is. It's just a kind of a convenience for people who are attending the meeting. Because often what happens is if you don't have that, people will publish a draft while other people are flying to the meeting, and then everyone's confused about what they're actually talking about. I'm really hoping to see that the folks who have been collaborating so well on the side of these meetings continue to do so outside of these meeting cycles, so that we can bring good materials to discuss into these meetings. I think we're done our work. I wanted to thank Gary and Google for hosting us so graciously. This has been great. And thanks to all of our scribes and their efforts. It's been fantastic. I haven't looked in and thanks to everyone for coming and discussing this in good faith and listening and expressing your views, expressing your preferences, and coming up with interesting memes. That's the later host. I don't forget that. So hopefully the proceedings. Good. Hopefully we'll clean up the minutes and we'll post those to the list. The editors are going to work on that draft. So please pay attention to the developments there and continue your discussions. And hopefully we'll see some of you in person who are online in Montreal.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, yeah. So thank you very much. Like I think it's really good. Like even in the 2.5 days, like I think the group has gotten like more cohesive. I like like Paul said, like there is probably more disagreement surfacing, but it's better that they surface and we talk about them rather than kind of keeping them and pretending everything is like awesome, right? Like I don't want to sing the song, but think about the song. But I think one of the things like we will work on the agenda for the meeting fast. To your question, like once the agenda is published, like we will have our agenda too, like for this meeting. And it really depends on what progress we make before, because the work group agenda deadline is like much later than the meeting agenda, which is like done. So we will see how the progress is made and figure out like how to dole out the time for the different topics to be made, right? So that will be published, so there's a deadline for that.
So it's just that I'm not clear. So, because when I said.
Here.
Thank you. So when I said that, is it going to be, is the planner, so it's a plenary? When I ask, is this gonna be informational, or are you gonna like, have like substantive discussion?
Substantive meeting.
So it's gonna be the substantive discussion, but then later on we can discuss it all on the meeting. So all the decisions will be made on.
100%, just as in the meetings, the decisions are made, yeah.
It's just that like, we might not be able to travel all the time to all these places, so.
Understood. Yeah, and that's, and I should have said, when we're planning these meetings, we're very conscious that the travel is onerous for a lot of people. It's either financially or in terms of time. And we're balancing the ability for people to participate in that fashion with the need to get people in the same room to actually understand other people's views and get the work done. And it's a very tricky balance to get. I think we've made good progress in this meeting. But if we're still doing this in a year and we're having these meetings every couple of months, that's a large commitment by a large number of people, and we're going to look at that askance.
Yeah, and please do talk to us about it, Fars, as well, right? Like, because there is some stuff that works better in an in-person setting, and we do have to balance that with like, are we not participants who cannot get to travel to the physical meeting? So I think we'd love to hear the other perspectives too, right? Like to go talk with the AD to kind of make sure that we balance these two out.
I will say that these meetings are going to be, just because of the time we have available and the focused nature, they're always going to be able to go deeper into these issues. The IETF meetings, because we only have, maybe 2 slots of an hour or 2 each, by necessity are going to be a little more shallow. And they're going to be more focused on socializing the progress that we've hopefully made with the larger IETF community. Because part of this process is when we're done, we go to IETF last call, and we have to get feedback from the entire IETF. And so if we go off in our little direction and we're happy with it and they're not, that's not good. So that's more, not completely, but more the focus of those meetings. And so you might make a decision that you attend a certain kind of meeting, but you don't attend other ones based upon those focuses. Okay.
Any last words other than leave those in jokes?
Thank you very much to the editors and thank you very much to the chairs.
Yes. Okay, we're going to shut down. Oh, and thanks for your patience, remote people. Hopefully see you soon.